After having clarified what Quarto is and what the underlying process is, we now want to go through the process of creating a Quarto document and rendering it to a particular format. So this is actually how you do it step by step. So first of all, you're going to create the Quarto document. Then you're going to fix the major metadata in the header of this document. And then you're entering a cycle where you first start to write text in Markdown syntax. Then you embed R code in the form of chunks into that document. And then you render your document to see the final results. Then you might add some text written in Quarto. You might add some R code again. And the idea is really that you're rendering your document over and over again. It's not a good idea to first write the final document with all Markdown and R written down, but it's a good idea to render it on the go many times, because that makes it easier to spot mistakes and to solve them immediately. Usually the quickest way of rendering an Quarto document is to render it for HTML. So this is what you usually do. Even if in the end you want to write a PDF document, during this cycle of writing your document and adjusting the code, it's usually the best idea to render it to HTML, because that's the quickest way of doing it. Now, after you're happy with both the R code and the text written in Markdown, you can basically share your work. And you share something that's fully reproducible. That's great. So now we're going through these steps one by one. First thing is to create the document. That's actually super trivial. So here's our studio. What you're going to do is to create a new Quarto document. You can also use a template, because there are a ton of templates there. In any case, you go on the new button in our studio, and then you choose Quarto document over there. Then you're coming to this here. I usually recommend you to click on create empty document. You already see the visuals editor over there. And in the upper left, you can choose between the source code and the visual editor. I usually recommend you to work with the source code, but sometimes some people prefer to use the visual editor, which basically goes into the direction of what you can see is what you get editor. In any case, while it might be best, especially for learning purposes, to start with a blank document, there are also a lot of templates that you can use. They are usually distributed as packages, and you will find more information about them in the internet. But as I said, for the learning purposes right now, we will always start with a blank document and put everything there in there on our own. What I usually recommend you then to do is, after creating the document, before you make any change, save it immediately, because this might save you a lot of pain later on. Taking into account what we've learned in the session about our project management, I would recommend you to create a subdirectory in your project folder. You can put the Quarto document in the subdirectory R, where you have all your R code, but most of the time I think it's even better to have a separate subdirectory called Quarto, where all your Quarto documents will reside. The next step is to fix the major metadata in the header. This is how our header looks like, and it contains all the meta information of your document. So it starts and ends with these three signs in the beginning and the end, and usually you should set at least title, author, and date. Although there is no meta information that is strictly required. Some of the meta information will be added automatically when you render the document, but most of it will be put by you there on purpose. And it's your decision which meta information you actually want to specify or not. The output arguments, like HTML in this case, they are usually set later in the process or automatically when you render the document. These parts here that are going after the keyword format, they determine the arguments, the argument called output format for the function Quarto render. Quarto render is a function of the package Quarto, which is always called when you render output. Although you might just use the point and click way of doing this from our studio, even if you click on the button to render a document that we will see later, under the hood, still this function Quarto render will be called. And everything you write there like HTML in this case here, will be passed as an argument to this function output format in the Quarto render function. There are more specific arguments of this function as well, and these are they are specified based on what you've written in the next level of this header. Yeah? So you see here this keyword TOC for table of contents, TOC location, number, sections. These are all part of the HTML part, and they specify how the HTML document is rendered by the function Quarto render. You see the different levels of this header. This is basically the structure of this YAML language that's used over there, and it's useful because you can also specify information for more than one output format. So you could also add in line 10 information about the specifics that should be taken into account when you create a PDF document. So you could say, for example, okay, if I render an HTML, I want a table of contents, but I don't want a table of contents if I use a PDF document. In any case, all these more specific things, they are translated into different arguments of the Quarto render functions, especially those arguments that are actually passed over to the pandoc engine that is then used to create the final document. As I said, this header is written in a language called YAML, and this is really not of central importance. For you, it's important that the structure of this header, it's always the keyword, the two dots, and then the key or the values that are belonging to this keyword. So, for example, here we have the keyword title, and the value corresponding to the title is a character string here, the title of my document. This is a nice overview of the major keywords in the Quarto docs, and I think this should be sufficient information for you right now. There are some general things that are immediately obvious. Whenever you want to change something in the final looks of your document or on the process of how this document is created, there's usually some way of adding keywords to the header that allow you to do exactly that. And usually the Quarto docs are the best way of looking up the ways you can actually translate your wishes to the keywords in the header of your document. Then we are entering this cycle of writing Markdown text, R code, and rendering the document. So let's start with how to write text in Markdown syntax. It's basically super simple because you just write the text as you would do it in any normal text editor. To format the text, you just follow the Markdown syntax. And that is, as I said in the beginning, it's best learned by example. There's this interactive Markdown tutorial in which you learn of how to do headings, italics, etc., etc. And I really recommend you to just do that. It's an interactive tutorial. It basically covers all the things that you need. Actually, the most important things come in the end, and things like nested lists and tables and so on, you can also learn later when you really need to. There is, as I said, the visual Quarto editor in RStudio that you can change in this upper left panel. And it might be useful because it gives you the feature of what you can see of what you get editor. I personally find it more confusing, so I like the source editor more, but that's really your personal preference. In any case, writing the main text is really just about writing very simple Markdown code, and that's best learned by using kind of interactive tutorial as suggested in the links provided. Embedding R codes and chunks, well, you know how to write R codes, so we now really focus more of this on this idea of a chunk. Yeah? So R code is written within these pieces called chunks, and in RStudio you see them as being these parts of the code that has this gray background. If you want to create a new chunk, you can either click here on this button or you use a shortcut. That usually saves you a lot of time. The idea is that every chunk starts with a line that looks like this, and it ends also with these 3 apostrophes. Within the chunk, you write R code just as you already know it, so there's nothing specific. So in the case you see here, on line 7, you have a normal comment, as you would have it in a normal R script. And line 8 and 9, as you see, they are just very conventional R code. In the chunk, you can refer to all variables that are defined within this single chunk or that were defined in previous chunks. So you can basically build in the second chunk, you can build on everything you have done in the first chunk as well. In principle, you can refer to all objects defined previously in your session when you're writing this document. You should be aware that if you render a document in using RStudio or any other engine, what is happening is that the computer basically restarts on everything and runs the document from the beginning to the end. So while you could use variables that are defined in later chunks within your interactive session, if you run the later chunk before the former chunk, this will not work if you render the document from scratch, because this is basically starting from an entirely new R session. Therefore, I recommend you, that's what I said in the beginning, I recommend you to render your document really regularly, because sometimes it happens that you're writing a chunk, you're writing a second chunk, and later on you're actually switching the sequence of these chunks. And if then in the chunk that was first, second, but then is put at the beginning of the document, you're referring to something in the other chunk, that works in your interactive session, but if you're then rendering the document, you will get an error. And this can become confusing, especially when you're working with a lot of different chunks. But these mistakes are very easy to avoid if you're regularly rendering the document. So to execute a single chunk, you can click on the play button at the beginning of the chunk on the top right. And if you want to execute all previous chunks, you can click on this button with the arrow to the bottom. This is useful if you, for example, want to see how a chunk would behave when the whole document is rendered from scratch. Then you just restart R. You click on the button right, left to the play button, and then all the chunks before that chunk will be executed, and you can see how this exact chunk is actually behaving during the rendering process of the document as a whole. If you want to control how the R code gets shown and executed when the final document is rendered, then you need to use the chunk options. Traditionally, these chunk options were added to the first line of the chunk within the curly brackets. So in this case here, the chunk has a name, and we have one additional chunk option, namely the chunk option echo, and echo is set to the value false here. This is here on the top. You see how the chunk is rendered where we have set the chunk option echo to true. And here we see the result, how the chunk is rendered when we see the option echo equals to false. So you see when echo is set to true, the code producing the output is shown and the output. On the right side, when echo is false, we only see the output of the code. And it depends on what you actually want to tell your readers, which of the two is preferable. There's also a more modern variant that is more consistent with the general Quarto syntax, and this is not to put the R chunk at in the first line within the curly brackets, but to write them within the chunk itself using a hashtag followed by a pipe. Note that if you use the traditional way, you are writing in classical R syntax. So in this case, false is written with capitalized letters, whereas in the right case, in the Quarto case, you're writing false all small, as you would do in the header, following the YAML conventions. So I think the Quarto syntax there is a little bit more consistent, and I think it's also easier to read because you don't have these many things put within the curly brackets. But in the end, it's also a question of preference and what you want to do. Good thing is, if you're writing the chunk options, you can get suggestions when you press the tab button. And when you create a new chunk, you can also access a point and click option by clicking on this button here. If you want to use one particular option in all chunks by default in your document, you can actually set these default options in the YAML header after the keyword execute. So in this example, there are two chunk options, namely chunk options warning and the chunk option echo. And the chunk option warning is set to false by default, and the chunk option echo is also set to false by default. That doesn't mean that every chunk within this document really needs to have echo false and warning false. It's just if you don't write something specific to a particular chunk, you will use the default options. And this is often very useful because often you write something and you don't want code to be shown in the final document by default. So it makes sense to set echo to false by default and only set it to true when you really want to show the code. Also, warnings, usually you don't want to want them to show up in your final document. So setting up warning to false by default is often a very good idea. A full list of all chunk options can be found in the Quarto documents. And I would really recommend to just scroll through this reference to see what is possible, and then just go along and write your documents. And whenever you find, okay, I actually would like to change this and that in my final document, you might either remember something from this reference list, or you go there directly again and you look it up. Then what's still missing is how to render your document. This should in fact be done regularly. As I said, it's not a good idea to write your Markdown or Quarto document from the beginning to the end in one step and then finally render it, because this makes it really hard to identify the source of an error during of the rendering process. So I recommend you to actually render your document regularly to HTML, because that's the fastest option. You can do that by either clicking on this button in RStudio, which I usually do. But as I said before, you could in principle also the functions of the Quarto package itself in your terminal. Still, usually clicking on the render button that invokes all these function calls for you is usually the safest option. It then creates in your working directory all the files that are the output of your rendering process. So in case you're creating a HTML file, as in this case, it creates the HTML file alongside with a folder that contains, for example, all the figures. And this format of the final file is determined by the header under the keyword format. Let's have another look at the header and the options, what's happening here. Here, the intended options below only apply to the documents that are rendered in this particular format. So theme, TOC, number sections, all this only applies to rendering processes that have an HTML file as their final goal. If you create a PDF document with this header, you will only use the default options set by Quarto itself. The theme is very similar to the theme option in ggplot2. It's just some general property sets, like, for example, the fonts of the document, the paragraphs, etc., etc. In this case here, with the TOC properties, we are setting, first of all, the fact that a table of contents is created in the first place. TOC depth refers to the kind of headers that are included in the TOC. So here we want to have level 1 and level 2 headings. And finally, we set the location of the table of contents. Note that the locations that are there, that are available for being chosen, sometimes also depend on the format chosen. So you have more options for HTML files than for PDF files, for example. And then the final thing that's given here in this example is that actually the sections in the final documents should be numbered. So all this, again, pretty self-explanatory and best learned by example and practice. So I recommend you to just have a look at the complete overview of options that is available in the Quarto docs. Then just write your documents, and whenever you feel uncomfortable with how your document looks like, then go again to the Quarto docs and see how you can change the header of your document to get what you actually want. Here's just another example of how these options translate into a final document. So this is an HTML file created with all the default options. And if we use the header below, this is how the alternative looks like. Yeah? So now we have a table of content. We have a slightly different set of fonts and paragraph styles used. We have the number sections and so on and so forth. So I really invite you to just try this out on your own, because this is really how you learn how to use these header options. Then finally, after you've done all that, so you rendered your document, now you want to share it because your work's basically done and you want to show others the result of your work. There are many different possibilities to share your work. I collected some of them in the further readings to that section. The key question is usually about the format. So do you want to share something, for example, as a policy report? Then it's probably best to have it as a PDF file. Do you want to just share it as part of a blog or via your web page? Then it should be HTML. That's usually a key question. And for all the common ways of communicating your results, can be sure that there is some option to achieve that in Quarto. Here's just one example for what is possible, because there are a lot of these nice fancy tools. Here's a very straightforward way for HTML documents. There's a service called Netlify that I, for example, also use to host my web page. And they have this subservice called Netlify Drop. It's basically on their web page. And it allows you to basically put your Quarto document directly on the internet. To do that, you basically need to create an HTML document using Quarto. You have all the relevant output data in one particular folder, and the main file you're creating is called index. So if you render it, there should be a file called index.html, and if you've done that, Netlify Drop is a very simple and nice thing to do, because all you need to do is basically you have your directory over there with all the files in there. You just take this directory, you drag and drop it to the Netlify account, and then you get a link to a web page on which you can click. And if you click on that link, you basically get your results in the internet, and you see everything. It's nice if you want to share in a quick and dirty way. If you register at Netlify, you can also change the URL and everything. And I'm just using that as an example to show you what is possible in principle. So there's a lot of good ideas out there, and you should just go a little bit, or skim a little bit through the Quarto blog to see what you can actually do. So that's basically it. Yeah. So these are all the relevant steps of creating a Quarto document, and I hope I have convinced you that it's actually not that difficult to do. So just learn a little bit Markdown using these interactive tutorials. You need to invest a little bit of time to learn the options you can set in the header of your document and in the chunks, and then you're basically set. And as I said, once you get the basics right and you know how to create, for example, an HTML document, there are tons of other options like creating websites, creating books, etc. A lot of good documentation out there that is very easy to understand once you've got the basics right. And I hope I made it clear that it's not that difficult, and I hope I gave you some help in kickstarting your use of Quarto.